think, now for something completely different, sort of an angle here. So I'm going to talk about a project that I've been working on as part of Petrus at the Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis at UCL. And this is Tales of the Park, which is a 3-month in-the-wild deployment of simple IoT devices designed to explore people's behaviour around security and trust and Internet of Things devices, funded by Petrus. And it takes the form of a 3-month public-facing device deployment in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. And unfortunately, this is a bit blurry, but that's one of our devices. But before I talk about the deployment in detail, I think what I'll start doing is talk about how we got there. So as IoT proliferates, more and more data about more places, people and things will be collected through these devices, be this in the urban environment or in the home. But this data is often invisible. We don't necessarily know what data is being collected, how it's being collected, by whom or why. I think it's quite difficult for people to understand the implications of data collection. And it's also very difficult to understand how this data moves around. And when we look at a device like the Amazon Echo, for example, much of the complexity of IoT is deliberately hidden from the user, but through the user interface. And therefore, it's not necessarily very apparent to someone as they interact with their Echo, for example, exactly how complex that might be. And so when you talk to your Echo, after hearing the Alexa keyword, it sends your voice data back to Amazon for processing on their speech recognition infrastructure. And this is then translated into this translates the spoken command into a directive, which is then sent to the infrastructure of the developer who made the skill for, in this instance, turning on and off the lights, which is then relayed back to the kitchen light in the user's home, which then turns on. So from the perspective of the user, you may have interacted with 2 devices, the Alexa and the light bulb. But in fact, you've probably interacted with about 5 different systems and potentially hundreds of devices. And I think that's very, very difficult to understand from a user perspective. And of course, each one of those devices could be logging those interactions. So in turning off the lights, you've actually left a digital footprint across many, many devices, which may not be entirely obvious. Now, within human-computer interaction, a number of researchers have pointed out that it's vital to maintain trust with people as they use technology. So if a technology, for example, gathers more data than seems reasonable given its intended function, or behaves in an unexpected way on the basis of the data gathered, it's very easy for people to stop trusting that technology and therefore stop using it. And with IoT, as data gathering is likely to proliferate, so too are opportunities for devices and services to behave in these creepy or slightly leaky ways. So beyond the immediate question of seeing whether and how people might interact with IoT devices in the urban environment, and specifically we're using Google's physical web platform, which is based on low-energy Bluetooth beacons. We also wanted to explore how we might use the affordances offered by IoT technologies to expose some of this complexity to people and to make a device which is deliberately leaky and shares information with other users and with people, and to see how they would interact with it and see how they would react to it. And we also, one thing we also needed to consider all the way along the line was how, as researchers, looking at these social questions through developing devices, prototypes, how do we explore questions of security, privacy, and trust around IoT using these methods without violating people's privacy in the process? So, our thinking on these problems led us back to another research project previously undertaken at CASA, which was called Tales of Things. So Tales of Things is a website and app which allows people to attach memories in the form of text, images, audio, or video to objects using QR codes. You print out a QR code and stick it to your object and record a memory, which is then saved to Tales of Things. If someone else comes along with their smartphone, scans the QR code, it then replays the memory back to you. So in this way, Tales of Things makes visible the invisible threads of memory which can connect people and things to one another. However, it became clear to us that in this context, we might be able to use memories as a proxy for real data. People might be willing to share memories of places with devices as well, and moreover, we could maybe use memories to show how devices share data with one another. So, gnomes. Having decided that this would be a productive way forward, we needed to think of a way to prompt interaction. Now, with Tales of Things, the object, in combination with the QR code stuck to it, is itself the impetus for someone to interact. You either want to tell a story about an object, or you want to find out someone else's story about that object. We knew at this point that our devices were going out in Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and we knew that Google's physical web platform, which was built around the principle that it could provide an easy web-based interface for IoT devices, would be our mode of interaction. However, a Bluetooth beacon in itself isn't really very interesting to look at. It's about the size of a AA battery, which is basically what it is with the Bluetooth chip inside it. So we 3D printed some garden gnomes for the beacons to go in. And I would say at this point that we don't just have gnomes, we have otters, and we have bees, and we have bats, all of which are designed to engage with the biodiversity themes of Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park. So the final step of the puzzle was the natural language interface, which obviously is a real growth area at the moment in the IoT space in the home. But we, looking into the history of natural language interfaces, or more colloquially, chatbots, they have got quite an interesting history. So one of the first chatbots was Eliza, created by Joseph Weizenbaum at the MIT Artificial Intelligence Lab in the 1960s. And when you chat with Eliza, she uses a pattern matching algorithm to basically repeat back what you've said to her. And if you've watched Adam Curtis's films, you'll probably know that Weizenbaum invented Eliza as a parody of the psychoanalytic style of the psychologist Carl Rogers, and designed it to illustrate that interactions between computers and people would only ever be superficial, because computers can't really understand what was being said to them. But Weizenbaum was very surprised when he made this chatbot, and when he tested it out on people, they found it very useful and confided secrets to it, and found it a very useful process for thinking about themselves. So in a funny sort of way, it didn't really work. But it occurred to us, thinking about this history, that a chatbot could be a really good interface for our devices. Firstly, because they can be quite fun to interact with. And if this wasn't fun, then I think we were pretty sure that we weren't going to get any interactions at all. But also because they can guide a visitor to a relevant submission, and we can use the chatbot script to tell people how the device will behave. And finally, we could use the interface to simulate something of the agency and autonomy that an IoT device has to the user, and reveal some of the complexity that's often hidden. So, thus Tales of the Park was born, which is a Bluetooth beacon-enabled, geolocated, 3D printed network of creatures that you can talk to on your smartphone. This slide shows the web app, which has a pixel art map of the Olympic Park, which encourages people to find our creatures. That is the pixel art map, which I'm very proud of, as I'm not much of an artist. Yeah, so having finalized our design, we then worked with Queen Elizabeth Park to actually produce the devices and deploy them. And one of the most fun bits of the project was working with young people from Academy Achievers, who are a community group based in Newham and who help young people fulfill their academic potential. So each of the creatures was named and painted by a young person from the group, and I will say this was quite challenging. I usually work with undergraduates. These guys were much better behaved, but one of them, well, the youngest in the group was 5, so one of our bees is bright blue, which is very nice. So after painting, they were mounted in plinths and deployed throughout the Olympic Park. So this is all of them in their different locations. We did have a problem. You'll see the bat down there has straight wings. He actually melted in the sun over the month of September, which was a little sad. So these are our models in place, ready to chat with. So when a user gets close to a device, if they've opted into the physical web, they get an alert on their smartphone's notification screen. And I will say this is a passive alert. Your phone doesn't buzz when you're near one of these things. But from the alert, you can then follow a URL and chat with the chatbot representing the creature. Each creature knows about the place in which it's located, but it wants to know more. And this bee, this is Rosie, she's at the bottom of the ArcelorMittal orbit, so she happens to know a lot about that. As you chat to her, she asks your name and then asks you for a memory about the park. And she explicitly tells you that she might share what you tell her with someone else. And if you submit a memory, she'll then give you a piece of information about the orbit or a memory that someone else left with her earlier. And what the natural language interface allows us to do, however, is to provide an analog for the autonomy and agency that an IoT device possesses. An IoT device can do things without necessarily being instructed to by a user, or might behave in a way which might be unexpected. So, using a cookie set on the user's device, we tracked interactions with the creatures. And what this allows us to do is when they speak to a second device, it's as if the devices have been talking behind your back. So you speak to a second creature, it already knows your name, it knows if you've submitted a memory, and it asks for something else. So in this way, what we've tried to do is demonstrate, we've tried to create a fun, safe way in which people can try to start to understand how data can move around a device network in a way that they might not necessarily be expecting to be the case. So far, more than 200 conversations, 200 people have had conversations with the creatures, and of these, 120 memories have been left. Most people have left what we might term public memories, so about the park and its venues and the content that's been placed on the devices. And most people, we don't know this, but most people have used plausibly real names. And as a side note, we've used a service called API.ai, now called Dialogflow, which is a chatbot building as a service, effectively, that you can deploy in many different contexts. And we'd already decided that we wanted people to be able to remain anonymous in this system. Interestingly, Dialogflow would only recognize Anglo-Saxon names as names, which is an interesting aside. However, some people did use pseudonyms, unless we really did have Jeff Goldblum visit the park. And we also have evidence of people not trusting the devices. So someone actually said, "Call me Boo because you're a stranger." And to give you an example of the sort of memories, I think we've got, I remember when this area was industrial and the canals and river were filthy. The last time I was here for Ride London 2017, it was a happy day, smiley face. There are many bats on the park and different species. I went on a bat walk in the park once. So, and that's what we mean by public memories. These are the sort of things you might leave in a visitor's book, for example. Yet, despite the fact that our devices were deliberately and explicitly leaky, and the fact that users didn't have to leave their real names, there was the possibility of identity disclosure. So we've got these two examples here. So I've come to the park to do fieldwork for geography GCSE. I got married in the Olympic Park, date redacted. And I think this really begins to illustrate why this data flow question is so difficult, because on their own, these things don't mean very much. But you combine that with a timestamp and a set of GPS coordinates, all of a sudden, you've got the potential for identity disclosure. And I think that's one of the things that's really difficult for people to understand. It's not just what data you're sharing, it's what the implications of that data sharing might be in the future. And that's one of the things that we've tried to explore with this. And this really brings me to my last point, which is more of a question about how we go about investigating these things as researchers. We need to know how people behave around IoT devices so that we can design better, safer, and more secure ones. And but what we can also do is we can use the affordances of IoT technologies to help people understand how they work better, and then they'll be more likely to trust them. Moreover, there is also a debate, which I think is only just really beginning to be had, about the politics of data. Who owns data? What right do they have to use it, and in what ways? And in what sense can people have been said to have meaningfully consented to the use of their data in future? And I think the fact that we've had to find proxies working with the Olympic Park so that we can conduct this research ethically also speaks to some of the anxieties that we have about IoT. I think most people don't really know what it is. They don't know how it works, and we get very nervous about what we might do, where it might be going in the future. But I think what we have here is sort of an example of how we might begin to design it, like design in, I guess, ways of allowing people to understand how that technology is working right into the device itself. And yeah, I wonder if we should be considering how we might demonstrate rather than hide the complexity so that people can understand them and trust them more in the future. Thank you.